Friends, we all know how easily Watchtower Corporation can get rid of its old light. And when they do this, they generally use one of two methods. Sometimes they do it with a special announcement or a magazine article that outlines the new teaching and the specific reasons for making the adjustment. But other times, old light is gotten rid of quietly, just by not ever mentioning it again, as if it had never even been taught. This is generally done with doctrines that have outlived their usefulness. Just this past week, I ran across an excellent example of this type of quietly changed doctrine on jw.org. But as I began to remember that this teaching had been used to arrive at the year 1975, I wasn't surprised at all that it had been quietly discarded, because it had definitely outlived its usefulness. You see, back in the 1970s and early 1980s, I remember that we were regularly taught that we, as witnesses, knew exactly how long each of the 7 creative days mentioned in Genesis chapter 1 were, that they were exactly 7,000 years long, and that the 6 days of creation mentioned there had taken exactly 42,000 years. 6 days times 7,000 years. Now, what on earth does the exact length of the creative days in Genesis have to do with 1975? Well, first let's look at the current teaching on this subject as found at jw.org, and then we'll examine the old lie that was taught for over 100 years, that first appeared back in 1912 and was put forward by Charles Russell. Here at jw.org, under the frequently asked question, do Jehovah's Witnesses believe in creationism? Number 1 contains, item number 1, length of the 6 days of creation is what we're interested in. It says, some creationists assert that the 6 days of creation were literal 24-hour days. But the second sentence here contains the change. But the word day in the Bible can refer to a considerable length of time. So now the creative days in Genesis were just an indefinite period of time. We don't know how long, but we know that they were just a long time. Now contrast that with the old light that first appeared in Zion's Watchtower of December 1st, 1912, in an article that was titled, The Creation of Things Mundane. Here we read, the 7th day of the creative week began with Adam's creation, and has already lasted 6,000 years, and is to be completed with 1,000 years reign of Christ. The 7th creative day will be 7,000 years long. Whoever sees this to be a reasonable deduction can easily suppose that the 6 preceding days of the Genesis account were likewise 7,000 years each. Reckoned thus, the total period from the time that divine energy began to operate upon the waste earth down to the time when the whole work of creation and restitution will be fully completed, that is, at the end of the 1,000-year reign of Christ, would be 7 times 7,000 years, or 49,000 years. So the old light went something like this. Since the 7th day of creation began when God rested or ceased his creative work, the 7th day must have began when he created Adam. This was later changed to when he created Eve, but we'll talk about that at the very end. Also, since the scriptures indicate that a day with the Lord is as 1,000 years, and that the millennial reign of Christ is also a literal 1,000-year period of time, therefore the 1,000-year reign of Christ can logically be viewed as a day of rest, or a Sabbath for mankind. Now, using a system of reverse logic, Watchtower concluded that this Sabbath, or the seventh day of 1,000 years, must logically be preceded by 6 days of 1,000 years each. This makes God's seventh day of rest a total of 7,000 years long. And by extending this reverse logic further back in time, the Watchtower concluded that each of the 6 preceding days, when God was actively creating, were also each 7,000 years in length. Therefore, the teaching was that God's creation took exactly 42,000 years. 6 days times 7,000 years equals 42,000 years. Now, how did all this speculation and supposition lead to 1975? Well, that's where Franz comes in. You see, he had come into the truth way back in 1914, and this teaching had nurtured his viewpoint on biblical chronology, believing fervently that we were currently living in God's seventh creative day of rest, and that the final 1,000 years of this time period would really be the 1,000-year reign of Christ. He realized that the year for the beginning of Christ's reign could be known if he could just determine the exact date for Adam's creation. And he did just that, fixing it at 4026 BCE. All that remained was to do the simple arithmetic of adding 6,000 years to that date, and like magic, he came up with 1975. These conclusions, along with much, much more, were published in the 1966 book, Life Everlasting and Freedom of the Sons of God. Let's listen to Franz in his own words summarize how he arrived at his conclusions concerning the year 1975 in this excerpt taken from a Los Angeles Circuit Assembly talk that he gave on February 10th, 1975.
Well, now since the 1,000-year reign of Jesus Christ has that very objective, it is only logical that before this seventh creative day of Jehovah God terminates, that this 1,000 years of the reign of Christ for this purpose should be realized. It should find its place within that seventh creative day, in fact be the final 1,000-year period within that seventh creative day of Jehovah God. So that if we add the two together, the millennial reign of Christ with the approximately 6,000 years of human history till now, we can see that it sum totals to 7,000 years. And by this we know that the 6 creative days which got ready the earth for the inhabitation of mankind were not 6 24-hour days, but they were 6 days of each 7,000 years. And when man came on the scene, it was approximately 42,000 years in progression. Well then, the big question for us now to determine is this. If we'll go to this red book here, Everlasting Life in Freedom of the Sons of God, and we turn to pages 31 through 35, we find there a chart which is headed Chart of Significant Events from the creation of man to the year 7,000 Anno Mundi, 7,000 from the creation of man. And the first item on the list is dated 4026 before our common era, and the item is the creation of Adam in the early autumn of that year. Not at January the 1st of that year, 4026, but in the early autumn of that year, so that we measure the years from autumn to autumn. And then if we turn to page 35, we are starting to see the year 1975, where we actually are. And what does it say with regard to 1975? It says the end, now notice this, the end of the sixth 1,000-year day of man's existence in early autumn. And then it carries us beyond that, beyond this year. The next date is 2075, 1,000 years from now. And what does it say regarding that? The end of the 7,000-year day of human existence in the early autumn. Now that's all it says about 1975.
Now it's very interesting that in those 5 pages of charts in that book, there was no mention of the date of Eve's creation. But as time got closer to 1975, Watchtower began to hedge a bit in its publications by saying that God really didn't begin to rest until Eve was created, and we don't really know how long it was between the time Adam was created and the time Eve was created. Now, I personally can remember sitting in the back of the Kingdom Hall in 1982 and listening to an elder explain to a new person who had asked about 1975. And he was explaining it by saying that we were still living in that unknown time period between the creation of Adam and the creation of Eve. Now, what if I had said, Elder so-and-so, I'm not sure that I still really believe in the 7,000-year-long creative days, and that we're living still in God's 7th day of rest. What do you suppose would have happened to me? And yet, what was then considered an established truth is discarded, forgotten, as if it had never even happened. Thanks for listening.